Ashley Hlebinsky joins us. Ashley is a noted arms historian. In other words, she's forgotten more about firearms than we'll ever know. She hangs out with people like Smith & Wesson, Winchester. If you've been to the Cody Firearms Museum, you can thank Ashley for curating that, putting it together. And I love, Ashley, I know the topic is Armed with Knowledge, this $1 million grant, but I want to talk about firearms and what you did at the Cody Firearms Museum. It is fascinating. Obviously, it is the be-all and end-all of firearms. If you ever want to see a museum dedicated to the history of firearms, everything about firearms. But I love the way you set it up because it's so approachable for someone who still needs guns 101, who doesn't know anything about guns, doesn't like guns or whatever. And then yet it also caters to those firearms nuts who know everything, and you'll find something useful there. It really appeals to everybody, Ashley.
Thank you. I feel like you should be the spokesperson for it because I think you said it better than me. But yeah, I was really proud of it, obviously. And I can't believe it's been 6 years, I think, since we opened it.
2019, yeah.
But no, it was a really good project because, and not to get too deep into it, but one of the things that we really liked about it was the fact that, we had so many gun enthusiasts that come through the door every year. So obviously we have a lot of guns on display for them. But because of the 4 other museums at the center, we were able to really have an opportunity to educate people, like you said, that don't necessarily have any knowledge about firearms. And so that was kind of a unique opportunity because if you think about other gun museums around the country, it's a one-stop destination. So people who are going to it are really interested in firearms. And so this was kind of a unique opportunity for an institution to be able to say, hey, here's some basic beginner information so that you walk into the museum and you actually have a sense of what's going on. We overthink that people don't know what a rifle, is or a musket. And so it was neat to be able to cater to both of those audiences.
Yeah, and not just both of those, but audiences internationally. You have to think about the people who may end up at the Firearms Museum. They could be international travelers on their way to Yellowstone. There'll be so many things to take into account, and I think you did it wonderfully at the museum. Fantastic job. And let's talk about now. You went from there, you've pivoted, and tell me about how you became executive director of the Firearms Research Center. It falls under UW College of Law. You're working with George Moxery. How did that all happen?
So it actually happened towards the end of my time at the Cody Firearms Museum. A colleague of ours, a mutual colleague of ours, introduced us because George obviously is a scholar in the Second Amendment in the legal sphere. I come from firearms and public education and material culture history. And he was looking to do a research center at, obviously his institution where he's a professor. And so, but he wanted to make sure that it was more interdisciplinary than just law. And that's something that I'm really passionate about as well, is trying to bring in different disciplines, law, history, culture, public health, business, engineering. We've been really touching a lot of different things over the past few years. And we wanted to be able to bring more voices into the conversation and help kind of reduce a lot of the misinformation that gets put out there on firearms around the country. Obviously, it's a very political topic. And when things are very political, it's difficult to be able to kind of sift through the information to kind of try to have a better understanding. And so George and I got connected. We actually had our first meeting in my office at the center. I actually wasn't curator anymore, so I borrowed it from my from my older sister who runs the museum. But I was still with the museum for a little bit after we reopened. And we had a meeting. He brought this crazy long map. He called it a mind map of all the different topics he wanted to get involved in. And so we started working on it together. And I believe it was 2023 when we officially announced our opening. And so we're still pretty young. We're still kind of a mom and pop shop. It's pretty much George and I. But this grant is actually, and actually another donor, an individual donor, has allowed us to be able to hire a full-time research director because George and I are actually not full-time. George is obviously a full-time full-time professor, and I'm actually a contractor. So I'm still working on museum projects around the country. And so having somebody dedicated full-time to gathering research and doing their own research and really helping the center, but then also this grant is kind of what their focus will be for the next couple of years.
I want to talk about the grant, what it is, what it means. Ashley Hlebinsky is with us, Executive Director of the Firearms Research Center at UW since, as she said, she's right, January 2023. That's what I have in my notes. You were right on. So when this is like really, a sort of a vision of George, but it's your baby. You like founded this, you thought it up, dreamt it up prior to this grant. We don't want to make it political, but prior to the grant, when this took off in 2023, it was the Biden administration. You were doing something called Firearms Research Center. Did you ever imagine, like, what could this thing be? Where is it going to go? And then, of course, President Trump gets in office and it goes $1 million worth. So, I mean, in the very beginning, Ashley, what was the dream? And then we'll talk about what Armed with Knowledge and the grant has made that dream become a reality now.
Yeah. So, and I want to say, I mean, this was George's initial, conception. And then I kind of have had this little, I'm short, so everything's little, soapbox that I've been on, because coming from my world and the history world, it's really difficult because so much technical research on firearms has been by the collector for the collector. And unless you know the collector to know whether or not they actually know what they're talking about, it's really hard if you come from outside that world to vet the information. But then on the flip side, you have academia, where you don't necessarily, you have a peer review system, right? A solid peer review system for publication, but it lacks a lot of peers in the actual firearms technical knowledge. And so I always was trying to marry the two, non-traditional, traditional academics and scholars together to try to come up with something that was more holistic in its approach. And so that's how George and I kind of got involved. But this was initially George's baby. And now I guess we share custody to some extent. But when we got started, we really didn't, because we're nonpartisan, we really didn't think too much about whoever, is in administration and whatnot, because that's not really our concern or focus. And we had a lot of success kind of regardless of that, because we have colleagues from different institutions that represent different and varying beliefs. What we found is we live in a very interesting space because we welcome all scholarship. And that necessarily doesn't get you a lot of funding opportunities. Obviously, if you're an organization that takes a hard stance one way or the other, there's usually funding opportunities that come. But when you are trying to allow dialogue, civil dialogue, respectful dialogue, it can be really difficult to find a home, I guess, to find a place to land. And so what's neat about this grant, it's a part of the Department of Education. It's in honor of the semi-quincentennial, which is a word I learned to say.
Whoa.
Semi-quincentennial, so the 250th. So it was put out there as kind of a call for applications in I want to say it was July, because it was a few weeks before my vacation. So I was working on this on my vacation to try to hit the deadline. But what's neat about it is this is really, this acceptance is a collaborative acceptance. So when you have a grant, and I've been a grant reviewer before, it's not just one or two people that say, oh, we think that this would be really great. Hey, why don't you do this? When it's a grant, especially coming out of, NEH or Department of Education, it goes to an external panel of reviewers from across the nation who are teachers and different, within that kind of sphere. So it's not just necessarily someone that would be like, oh, I'm super interested in firearms. So we kind of had to get buy-in from a whole host of people, and I don't know who they are. It's always, kind of a blind review, but we can actually get feedback on it, and we'll probably be able to take a look at that now that the government's open. But that's what's neat to me, is because it almost crosses or neutralizes political lines, because there are many people that are involved in making this decision, and they come from the actual world. So the teachers that we're hoping to reach, which I think is pretty neat.
Good point, Ashley. Armed with Knowledge, this 2-year, $1 million grant is meant to be a nonpartisan, can't say that, in bold letters enough. Second Amendment initiative. It's so exciting. Good news for UW. Outside of this grant, Ashley, let's talk about full disclosure. Firearms Research Center receives a lot of its funding from gun manufacturers, firearm manufacturers. Is there an attempt to build a firewall there saying, hey, we'll take your money, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're your marketing staff?
Yeah. So actually, obviously we put out all of our press releases on where our funding comes from. But I would say most of our money now comes from individuals and private foundations. We actually just got a gift from the Jeff Cooper Foundation, which is kind of neat. He was a firearms writer, instructor, but it came from a foundation. And so the role when it comes to donating to a nonprofit, and I was really, really passionate about this at Cody, sometimes to my own detriment, I guess, because the number one rule is donors don't dictate content. And so when we accept a gift from somebody, it does come in unrestricted. It doesn't get dictated one way or the other. There are no stipulations on it. And if there are, we don't accept it. And again, sometimes maybe to my own detriment, but I feel very, very strongly about that. I did with my museum, and obviously I do at the research center. And when it comes to some of that funding, a lot of that goes into what people have to realize is there's the Second Amendment side of what we do, but then we are also educating people who are interested in working in different sides of firearms law that has absolutely nothing to do with the Second Amendment. They may be interested in product liability. They may be interested in a career at the ATF. They may be interested in working for a company. And so we do have an internship program that we do every year where we place students who are interested in learning more about that subject matter. And so because it's such a niche subject, that's kind of where we do a lot of that work. So it is associated with the center, but it's also a little bit different. It's more of our student initiative to help them kind of place them in jobs, once they get done with law school. And so it's a little bit of a different, it's a yin and a yang, I guess. But when it comes right down to it, we are always very careful when we accept money to make sure that people they don't have expectations too, right? And then also that we are able to remain true to our mission and be able to get our work done. So
Chatting Guns with Ashley Hlebinsky, arms historian, former curator of the Cody Firearms Museum, and that makeover, that glow up in 2019, that's just fantastic. If you haven't been there, you got to get there. She's now executive director of Firearms Research Center. We're talking about the 2-year $1 million grant received by UW College of Law and the Firearms Research Center. Ashley, one last thing. This is right in your wheelhouse. The perception of many from outside of the United States is, the U.S., America, they're gun crazy there. Guns, guns, guns. But you know what? There's some truth to that because firearms, the firearms role in how you can't ignore firearms when it comes to retelling a history of America. It is instrumental. You can tell a whole history line through firearms. That's what you do. You know it.
Yeah. So 2 points to that. One, what I find really interesting is it's actually some of the largest firearms collections in the world are outside of the United States. I'm actually building a firearms museum up in Canada. If you can believe it right now.
I can't believe it.
But we're talking Cody had 7,000 firearms. We're talking 20, 30,000 firearms in England and in Europe.
Wow.
And sometimes I feel like it's easier to study firearms academically in Europe because it doesn't come with all that political baggage and stigma, which is kind of an interesting thing. But then you're correct. You're absolutely correct in the idea that you can't really talk about the history of the United States without talking about the history of firearms. And I always say good, bad, and indifferent, right? There's always different types of that conversation. And that's kind of my specialty, is to study those evolutions and those changes. But I think people would be really shocked to know how integral firearms are to understanding a lot of different parts of our culture, from, Henry Ford visiting Winchester in 1909 and having that inspire him to build his Highland Park factory in Detroit, and Eli Whitney, who allegedly invented the cotton gin, but I won't get into that drama. But he had his cotton gin, but he also had a government contract to make firearms, and let's see, Remington made sewing machines and Singer made gun parts, so there's this interconnectivity that I think, today in our society, there's such a, hard debate that people who don't know anything about guns or don't like guns kind of see guns, gun culture, gun owners as this like side thing, this subculture. But in reality, it's so much more integral to that. And I think sometimes that harshness of the debate really obfuscates, there's a good academic word, really obfuscates that larger history that I think is a really good starting point for people to have conversation that isn't necessarily emotional or, politically charged.
Ashley's dropped two $5 words on us already in our brief conversation. Holy cow.
I had my coffee.
And you're right. I could see that. Like in America, we are sometimes speed bumped by bump stock and assault rifles and what defining the fire, wherein is in other countries, maybe not so. It doesn't have to get so politically charged. And yeah, firearms have played a role in our history, from the things you mentioned, which I had no idea, to stuff like the gun that won the West, the Sharps 50 that nearly decimated the bison population. Firearms have just played an unbelievable role. Ashley, it's so cool to talk to you. I can't believe there's such a thing like this at a college, but if there was, I believe it's at UW.
That is a true statement.
What is a perfect place for it, man. That's so neat. You got to come on again. We got your number now,
I love
so
it.
You can't hide. We're going to find you.
I'd love to.
Thanks for being on.
Thank you.